morning and welcome. This is the Thursday, February 17th meeting of the House Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. I want to thank all those brave souls who got through the weather and made it in this morning. Thank our staff for being here this morning to help us get through the committee meeting. Today, we're going to have some special guests, and we're going to talk about integrated resource planning and basically strategic planning. I told you this is kind of to get a feel for where the industry is going in terms of electrical generation, some of the pressures that they see in the market and how they're responding to them, and where they think they need to be to position themselves in the market to continue to serve the people of the state of Kansas and their customers. So kind of an exciting topic. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions as we go forward this morning. So we'll get right to it. And I want to thank Mr. John Bertson, Vice President of Generation with Evergy, for being with us this morning and welcome you to the committee. You're up.
All right. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is John Bertson, and I lead the generation business for Evergy, which includes natural gas, coal, wind, small amount of solar, and then I have an oversight role for the Wolf Creek nuclear plant. I'm a lifelong Kansan and a mechanical engineer, and I've spent my 29-year career in power generation in Kansas. One thing that'll become obvious to you as I speak over the next few minutes is I'm not a professional speaker, so please forgive me for shortcomings there. Turn into slide 2. If everybody's got a packet, it's this one with the nice little colorful map on it. My company provides electric service to a large swath of people in the eastern half of Kansas and the western third of Missouri. We have generation assets spread throughout the state of Kansas and parts of Missouri. In addition to supplying power to our own customers, we supply power to others through the Southwest Power Pool, which manages the grid in this region, and smaller utilities, municipalities, rural electric cooperatives, and others throughout the state. Turn into slide 3, Evergy by the numbers. We have over 10,000 miles of transmission lines, over 15,000 megawatt hours of generating capacity, including 4,300 megawatts of renewable energy largely through wind. And we use these assets to serve our 1.6 million customers and strive for a reliable, affordable, and safe product for our customers. Flipping over to slide 4, I want to talk about the main topic here this morning, the Integrated Resource Plan, or I'll shortcut that to IRP as we work through this. We established 4 key principles in developing our IRP. They are an unwavering commitment to safety and customer affordability, uncompromising fidelity to high standards of environmental stewardship and progress toward a zero carbon future, technology-enabled transition of our aging fossil generation fleet to more sustainable and cost-competitive generation technologies, and prudent use of existing fossil fuel resources through the end of the useful life of the existing assets. Ultimately, we want to balance safety, reliability, affordability, and sustainability to meet the diverse energy needs of our customers and communities. To facilitate that, we've introduced an extensive stakeholder process to develop a long-term plan for delivering energy to our customers, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. On slide 5 are some of the core tenets that we use in the integrated resource planning process. We focus on value and affordability, on safety, flexibility, or said differently, maybe resiliency, to make sure that we have a diverse set of energy supply so that we don't have all our eggs in one basket, if you will. Environmental stewardship, and then reliability. On slide 6, we'll get into a little bit more about the process of the IRP. What is an integrated resource plan? Well, first of all, it's a long-range plan in Kansas, 10 to 15 years, and in Missouri, 20 years, to try to understand what is expected for the needs of the customers of Kansas and what's the best way on balance to meet those needs for Kansans. It is a 10 to 15 year look in Kansas. The resource plans may include new generation resources, whether they be traditional and or renewable. Demand side management, so that would be things like energy efficiency in your home. Today you can buy a thermostat with a little mobile app and you can adjust your temperature from the meeting room today to manage your electricity use and energy use at home. So that sort of thing. In the industrial world, we have some customers that are willing to reduce their production and use less electricity during periods of high demand or high cost. And so that's another form of demand side management. In Missouri, we have a requirement to file the IRP every 3 years, and then we have an annual kind of true up or look to see if anything major has changed. The Kansas process is that we file the same document in Kansas within 3 months of filing it in Missouri. The goal ultimately is to determine that preferred plan that strikes the right balance of safety, sustainability, affordability, and reliability for customers. Slide 7 shows some of the key components. The cost of existing resources. So if we think about the Lawrence Energy Center to the east of us, what does it cost over the next 15 years to keep that plant operational, and how does it benefit the customers? Cost of new resources that might be new renewables, either in the form of solar or wind, or it could be a new gas turbine that we would install. The commodity costs, which are largely fuel, so price of natural gas, which we've enjoyed pretty stable prices for the last 5 years or so, but in the last 12 months, we've seen a return of some volatility to natural gas. And coal would be the other really, really big one. And then load assumptions, so that's that demand side. How much power do we expect customers to use? Reliability and capacity requirements to ensure that we have enough power for the customers of Kansas when they need it. Existing resource retirements, so power plants don't have an infinite life. We can extend their lives and have done that largely with our coal fleet here in Kansas, but at some point you have to put so much back into them, meet new regulations, that the economic proposition may not make sense for the Kansas people. Retirement-driven transmission costs. So the grid is dependent on generators being in certain locations. And if you retire a generator, you may have to make some upgrades on the transmission system to make sure it maintains a reliable state. Demand side management that we talked about a little bit before, that's that energy efficiency type stuff. And then we do a risk sensitivity and analysis. As I mentioned, natural gas has returned to a little bit of volatility here. So you don't want to plan on $2.50 a million BTU gas being, stable and steady all the time. You want to do some sensitivity on what happens if gas goes to $5 or $7, right? Turn into slide 8. I'll be brief on this, but it is our stakeholder outreach process that we used in our 2020 planning. But really what we want to do is make sure that we're listening to key groups in Kansas that represent the diverse feelings of Kansans to make sure that we strike a right balance for all of our Kansas customers. Flipping to slide 9, here's a high-level overview of the analytical process. Inputs to the process include demand forecasts, or how much power do we expect our customers to use. Fuel price forecasts, so like we talked about natural gas a bit and what's going to happen with coal, what happens with nuclear fuel costs, et cetera. Cost to keep existing generation running, to provide maintenance and reinvestment to keep the machines reliable. And then costs of new generation and new technologies that continue to develop. We then test critical uncertain factors. So again, that's some of the stuff like the volatility around natural gas. We'll run a low, mid, and high case to try to understand how sensitive the plan is to swings in fuel volatility. Similar with demand, what happens if customers use less energy than what we predicted, or they use more energy than what we predicted? How sensitive is the plan to those? And then environmental rules is another big impact that comes about with a heavy fossil fleet. We generally think of that in form of increased cost due to something like a carbon tax, if that would ever come to fruition. We then develop alternative resource plans to find a balanced plan that meets customer needs. And again, focusing on that reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy. Flipping to slide 10, we take all of those alternative resource plans into account. We run multiple scenarios adjusting for those critical uncertain factors or those sensitivity analyses. And the result is a ranked list that shows the net present value of an option or the economic value to a customer. And we rank those. In the 2020 IRP process, the result of that was over 2,000 different scenarios that were reviewed. And then finally, on slide 11, and then I'll open it up for questions, is the result of our 2020 plan. It would show that we would intend to get more of our energy from renewable resources and rely less on coal-fired capacity as our existing coal plants age into retirement. And notably, we've already cut carbon emissions in half from 2005 benchmark levels, and the current IRP would have us to a 70% reduction by 2030. With that, I'd love to hear and answer questions.
Thank you very much. Questions for this conferee? Representative Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the presentation. Just a quick question, and I guess asking for your opinion here. There's been some talk over the last few years about establishing a cabinet level agency charged with developing an energy plan. And I'm gathering here the KCC requires you to have your own internal resource plan for 10 to 15 years, Missouri 20 years. Do you think that cabinet level agency would be overly redundant, or do you think that redundancy is good? Just your opinion.
Well, my personal opinion, I haven't thought about it a lot, is anything we can do to help us understand what Kansans want, what they want their priorities to be is important. So I think we've got a robust process right now that gets that stakeholder input, that if, the wisdom of the committee and the folks that govern the state would say we could be helped by a cabinet level position, we would be happy to work with them.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking at slide 2, just out of interest, about 5 years ago, I took a tour of the landfill here in Topeka, and they were running their plant on methane gas that were coming. And I just saw that in one area right there. Is methane gas a resource that really could be used, or is this just something that just Topeka uses for that one site?
No, it absolutely is a resource that can be used. Landfills are the most common use for that. Tends to be pretty small generators. I can't remember off the top of my head what the size of the facility is, but it's 4 or 5 engines, right? My company actually buys the power off of that facility and uses it for our customers. So.
And then just I don't know if this is a good question or not, but Pittsburgh was looking into having their own power facility, doing it privately or whatever. And they decided not to and stayed with Evergy. Last year during that hard storm, would they have been hurt bad if they had not stayed with Evergy?
Well, that's hard for me to answer without knowing a lot of facts and details. But generally, I would say whenever you're part of a bigger group that's geographically distributed, economies of scale come into place to control cost. If we had a power plant in an area that a switch gets frozen over by ice and it trips off, we can rely on another plant in another area where maybe the weather's more favorable and use the transmission system to deliver power. So broadly and generally, I think we're better off being part of a bigger organization that provides some resiliency.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And by the way, you've done wonderful on your presentation, so thank you. Sell yourself short. Slide 11, where you had your integrated resource plans on here. First question is, I'm looking at the graphs moving from 2020 to 2040 range. Is there a cap? What I'm going to call it capacity ceiling. I don't want more than X% of my generating power coming from one particular source in your planning? Is there a limit that you're putting on it?
Well, no specific cap is set, but I'll tell you, we really value diversity. I think I may have talked about that a little bit, but you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. As an example, we've talked about the price of natural gas volatility. Coal back in the early 2000s, seemed like a great investment. So we spent a lot of money investing in pollution control equipment to meet new regulatory requirements. At that time, natural gas was pretty high. But then the shale revolution impacts came into play, and all of a sudden, for a few years, we had a very low, by a historical basis, stable natural gas prices. We've started to see a return to volatility, right? So we were able to rely on our coal sources when gas was high, back them down and become more flexible with them and get more energy from renewables and natural gas on the peaks when we needed to. And then we've also always had that stable nuclear source as well. But even nuclear, as valuable as it is, has come in and out of favor many times over the decades, right? After World War II, building up into the 50s and 60s, it was going to be too cheap to meter, I think was one of the slogans I've heard they used when we built Wolf Creek. And then, most of you in the room maybe remember the 3 Mile Island incident in Pennsylvania. So all of a sudden, regulation came in with nuclear and costs went up, and nuclear didn't seem so good for a while. Nuclear started to have a renaissance, and the environmental groups that once were opposed to nuclear actually became in favor of it when climate change became a hotter topic. And so nuclear was on the rise again, starting to come back. And then we had a nuclear power plant accident in Japan. And all of a sudden, nuclear seems a little too risky again, right? So every technology gains and loses favor over a period of time, and maintaining a diverse portfolio is very important.
Right. And boy, you're 100% on, because I remember sitting in this committee, people almost complaining about Evergy, where they were coal-based and natural gas is so cheap and it's so plentiful right now. Why aren't we using more of it? But boy, the tides are turning here, and we're seeing the diversity needs. The next question I've got, when I look at the graph on that same page, hitting into 2040, we're actually dropping off a little bit on the nuclear use. And do you foresee SMRs coming in to play within the state here?
Well, small modular nuclear reactors are a technology that we're watching. It's not quite ready for prime time yet, or to be commercially available where it would make sense for our customers, but it's absolutely one we're keeping an eye on.
Especially getting out toward 2040.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Speaking of aging resources and history, it is Representative Delperding's birthday today. So
Happy birthday.
I'm going to take a minute to recognize him.
I think I'm officially into antique status now.
Well, we'll do everything we can to extend your useful life here, Representative Delperding. So we do have several other questions for you, but I want to jump in and just on that same page while we're talking about the graph for the 2040 estimates on generation type. The sources of dispatchable power by 2040 in this graph seems to be reduced quite a bit, and more reliance on what you label as storage and enabling technology, obviously batteries, but what else do you put in that category?
Yeah, it's a bit unknown at this point. I'm an engineer, so I really truly believe technology continues to advance. I've seen it happen in my lifetime and career, in a major way. Used to be you had to stand in the kitchen with a corded phone and make a phone call, and where I lived, you did that on a party line, so it had to be at a time when a neighbor wasn't on there. And today we all have these mobile phones, and so very similar has happened in the wind when we did our first wind farms, largely due to state mandates. Back in the mid 2000s or so, the price was pretty high, but we've learned how to harvest more energy from the wind at a lower cost. That's become more efficient, and so when farms have increased their productivity and value significantly. So I can't tell you exactly what that technology will be. I can tell you we won't make big moves in dispatchable energy until we identify and that technology is proven and commercially available. We just can't put the reliability of Kansans at risk in that sort of fashion. So don't know what it'll be, but we're banking on on some of that coming, and we will not move aggressively towards that plan until that technology emerges.
Thank you. Representative Schreiber joins us online.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, John. I was curious, staying on page 11 again on your presentation, you talked briefly about the age of certain resources and so forth. Do you kind of identify expected lifespans of different types of technology, whether it's coal? We heard from Wolf Creek a couple of weeks ago about, their licenses coming up in 2045, I believe. So, some of that's definitive with a license, but say a coal plant or a gas plant, wind farms, whatever, do you kind of plan on a certain lifespan for those different resources?
Yeah,
Thank you.
we do, Mark. I won't go into the nuclear if it sounds like you guys heard from Cleve, my partner, recently, but with a coal plant, they were originally designed with a 35 or 40-year life. But, just like an old John Deere tractor, you can run those things forever as long as you maintain them well. And so that's sort of what we've done with our power plants. I haven't said that, by the time you get to 55 or 60 years of age, you start to see things that you've never seen before, like cracks in some of the, structural metal of the generators and of the boiler components. And so we believe there's a point in time where it's going to become too costly to continue to maintain those. Right now, we tend to think of that as being around 55 or 60 years of life for a coal-fired power plant. I think about gas turbines a little bit differently because they're, room size generators, maybe a little bit bigger than this room, maybe like your high school gymnasium or something. There's significantly less cost to continue to upgrade those, replace components. They haven't run as hard for their life as our coal fleet has. And so I really think of our gas turbines as not really having an end of life that I can see, but we do kind of plan for them in a similar fashion for planning purposes, but I believe we can continue to extend those. Wind farms, initially, we thought that they would run for about 20 years. So most of the wind farms are in rates at a depreciable rate that brings them down to zero towards 20 years. But I personally believe we can extend the lives of those just like we have our coal-fired and steam-fired power plants by replacing components, upgrading components, or just doing good maintenance. And, I don't think 30 years on the initial equipment as a wind farm is beyond the realm of possibility. I think that's very real.
Representative Carmichael, also online.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to publicly confess to Old Man Deplerdang, as well as the committee, that I was one of those people who was saying, gosh, I wish we were 100% natural gas a few years ago. So I will plead guilty to that. My question, though, is I was pleased and surprised to hear that Evergy's second priority behind safety is affordability. And why I'm so surprised by that is everything I see says Kansas has the highest electric rates in the Midwest, and that Evergy leads the pack in high electric rates. And looking at my bill for this month, I do appreciate the $6.08 merger credit. But can I expect to see my electric bill go down? If so, when and by how much?
Well, I'm not going to have the when and by how much on the top of my head, but I am a Kansan, as I said earlier in the presentation. So when I think about our customers, I'm thinking about my mother, my brothers and sisters who don't have as good a job as I do, and friends and family that live throughout the state. So I'm always working to try to control costs for them, and I tell all the people that work for me that's what we're here to do. A lot of the reason the rates are higher in Kansas is because of some of that environmental investment we made in coal when natural gas was still pretty high, kind of before the shale revolution. And we believe those were prudent and good decisions at the time on behalf of our customers. And then to enable the renewables required some significant investment in transmission infrastructure so that we could move the power from where it's at, largely out in western Kansas, where the load is at, largely in eastern Kansas. So that's the reason some of the cost increases have occurred. I think as volatility has returned to natural gas here recently, that some of those decisions will look good again in hindsight. We are focused on controlling customer cost.
A brief follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah,
If,
briefly.
if you're not the right person at Evergy to ask when, if, and by how much my bill is going to go down, who is the right person for me to ask at Evergy to get the answer to that question, which I really think concerns my constituents every time they open their electric bill?
Yeah, I think Darren Ives is somebody you may be familiar with. He's our head of regulatory and works primarily on the rates. He would be the right person.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here in your testimony. On slide 4, you talk about balance, safety, reliability, affordability with the diverse energy needs. I'm just wondering, has the need changed? Aren't folks basically just in need of, when they flip the switch, they want the energy to come on? And I wonder, does that refer to different social demands for sourcing of power rather than the actual need? Thank you.
Good question. So a little bit of both, right? I do believe Kansans expect the lights to come on when they flip the switch. I don't think they're ready for power rationing, although we see that going on in some states around the country where that maybe has become acceptable. I don't live there, so I don't know, but I know it occurs. But I believe that Kansans want power when they want it and when they need it. I also believe they want to understand the price that they're paying for it so that they can make an educated decision. But really, what I refer to is, what is the expected demand as energy efficiency comes into play, and some people adopt that, some people don't. What's that do to the average household usage? It does have to do with social and belief issues around climate change and that sort of thing. But it's really, really hard to strike a good balance there. There's just quite a few diverse thoughts in the state.
If I have a second. So, knowing that utilities put a lot of time and effort and file these plans, and the chairman already asked the question about the portfolio and showing heavily going to storage-enabled technology. And I think Mr. Casely that was here earlier basically said at this point, that's an unknown, and you've said the same thing. So it's somewhat of an aspirational plan in that regard. But it is a plan, and when things don't work, you guys are the ones that get the phone calls. So I hear talk of having a state energy plan. So maybe you could shed some light on the value of what this is. This is put together by the folks who get the phone calls when it doesn't work versus what that might be in states that you may be familiar with. Thank you.
I'm not really familiar a lot with things that happen outside our jurisdiction. However, I do know that some states try to provide an energy policy and try to shape what the capacity and energy resources look like. I think the best way for us to do it here in Kansas is through our stakeholder process. Let us know, listen to multiple groups about what they're thinking, and then we, in a conservative fashion, are going to try to manage the energy portfolio so that we have a good, diverse mix. So, I'm a believer in renewables to help lower rates in Kansas. But I want that coal-fired battery backup when the wind isn't blowing. And I believe that's on the whole, that's what Kansans want. And so that's sort of the way that we plan until we hear different signals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll take the privilege of the last question for you.
Yes,
So obviously you operate in Missouri and Kansas. You probably see other integrated resource plans for other entities. We're going to talk to a couple more this morning about them. How different or similar is Evergys IRP from other IOUs that you see or are familiar with?
Well, ours is still more reliant on coal assets. That's because in Kansas and Missouri, we've made long-term investment decisions for coal-fired power plants and believe that we need to extract the full value out of those for Kansas and Missouri customers that have paid for those. Other states have moved more quickly away from coal, for any number of reasons. Age could be one of them. If you're in the east, where high sulfur coal is what was burned, and the EPA regulations get you to a point where the cost of the technology to continue to burn that doesn't make economic sense, is a lot of the reasons that they've moved away from coal. For us, we have the advantage of hauling low sulfur coal from the Powder River Basin in Wyoming to Kansas and Missouri, and it's a pretty short haul compared to Texas or Southern Company, which has Georgia, Alabama, and some of the areas in the southeast. So some of that transportation haul cost makes coal more advantageous for us, but I'd say that's one of the major differences: more renewables and more coal, and probably less reliance on natural gas.
Thank you, Mr. Britson, for your time this morning, your testimony to the committee. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next up, our next two presenters will both be appearing virtually this morning. First is Todd Tarter, Senior Manager with Liberty. And is Mr. Tarter online?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you. I think as you talk, we'll get video as well.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully better video than that.
Do you have video now?
There you go. We got you.
Okay,
Fast
great.
improvement.
Okay, I did have a slideshow. Were the slides going to be presented virtually also online?
Yes, they will.
Okay, thank you.
Just tell us when you want them rotated.
Okay, will do. Yeah, I think we're ready to get started. Well, first of all, thank you for letting me appear virtually today and talk to you about integrated resource planning. I work for Liberty Utilities. My name's Todd Tarter. I'm the Senior Manager of Strategic Planning, particularly in Liberty's Central Region. And the Central Region includes the Empire District Electric Company. So I will refer to us as Liberty-Empire. Empire's been around since 1909, but we were acquired about 5 years ago from Algonquin, and Liberty is the name of the utilities, the U.S. utilities for Algonquin. So next slide, please. And a little bit about us before we get started talking about our IRP. The service territory map on the left kind of shows all the commodities that we have for Liberty Central Region. And by the way, Liberty does have an East region and a West region. But as far as our IRP, it's only for the electric part of our business. So the Empire District Electric Company serves 4 of the states and primarily in Missouri. We have 16 counties in Southwest Missouri. We have 3 counties in Northeast Oklahoma, 1 county or a part of that county in Northwest Arkansas, and 1 full county in Southeast Kansas. And that would be Cherokee County. So that would be towns like Baxter Springs, Columbus, Galena, Riverton, and then some other small towns in some rural area. And by the way, that is the area I was born and raised in Southeast Kansas. Went to college at Pittsburgh State University. So that's kind of where I grew up. I live in Joplin now. Our largest city that we serve is Joplin, Missouri. We also serve the Branson, Missouri area. And as you can see from the table there, we're predominantly in Missouri for our electric. 89% of our customers are located in Missouri. However, we have less than 10,000 meters in Kansas, but they are our second largest jurisdiction for electric, followed by Arkansas and Oklahoma, which are typically about the same size. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to probably tag a lot off of Evergy here because I'm talking about IRP, they're talking about IRP. We serve a lot in the same jurisdictions. So the IRP rules are very similar that we have to abide by. So just some IRP basics that I thought I'd give you. We are required to file an IRP in Missouri, in Arkansas, and Oklahoma. We have formal IRP planning rules there. I've listed the Missouri Utility Resource Planning Rule there. It's part of the Code of State Regulations. And it is a fairly detailed and extensive rule and fairly prescriptive that we have to follow. So really it kind of meets or exceeds everything that we need to do in Arkansas and Oklahoma. We keep everything on the same 3-year cycle because I think it's important to note that even though we file in 3 different states, we really have just one IRP. We do a system-wide IRP planning and for all of our states and all of our customers. And like it was mentioned from the last presenter, it is a triennial compliance filing. The major full compliance filing is due every 3 years. But in Missouri, we also have the requirement, like Evergy mentioned, of an IRP annual update in all other years. And we last filed our annual update in Missouri in March of 2021. And in Missouri and the other jurisdictions that we serve, it's at least a 20-year planning horizon. And we're looking for multiple resource plans. We may model 15 to 20 different alternate plans for the future because nobody knows exactly what the future is going to hold. But then we have to come up by rule with one preferred plan and a set of contingency plans. And we are currently developing our 2022 IRP right now. We plan to file that in Missouri in April, and then in our other jurisdictions after that based on their 3-year filing cycle. And our most recent IRP was done in 2019. So next slide, please. So as far as a high level overview, and there can be a lot of detail that goes along with IRP planning. So I thought what I would do is do this in the form of the volumes that we file in the states that we file in. So, we have an executive summary, obviously, and then, the index of rule of compliance. But what I have highlighted in red there are the technical sections of the Missouri IRP rule. I call the first sections load analysis and forecasting through demand resource analysis the pre-integration phase. During those phases, we actually have a stakeholder process in Missouri where we have informational meetings as we're developing this out. And by the way, this process takes about a year when you consider you have to file for any waivers from the rule a year in advance. So it's quite a long process. We actually hire some consultants to help us in each of these pre-integration phase areas. And then, also just the fact that, this can be a costly process that involves a lot of people. So in our load analysis and load forecasting, as mentioned by the previous presenter, we don't just have one forecast. We at least have a base, high, and low that we look at throughout the period. And our supply side resource analysis, we look at existing resources and then candidate resources for the future. Have to look at retirement dates of existing resources for planning purposes and so forth. The section does have a transmission and distribution analysis that was added during a rule revision. And then demand side resource analysis, which is energy efficiency and demand response programs for the customer. By rule, we're required to have a pre-integration meeting. Once those first section is complete, we have that meeting so we can go over our major assumptions and our plans for how we look at our alternate plans and also what our critical uncertain factors will be for risk analysis. So we have those discussions, and stakeholders in Missouri do have the opportunity to comment on those if they wish. And then kind of what the core of this, we kind of bring it all together, and as the name would imply, it's all integrated together. Volume 6 that we file is our integrated resource plan analysis. That's where a lot of the modeling goes and brings all this together, and also does the risk analysis over all these plans. And of course, the end game is in the resource acquisition strategy selection, where as a company we have to have a preferred plan and of course a set of contingency plans. And a preferred resource plan As far as the Missouri rule goes, it does say that the primary criterion for selection is to minimize the net present value of revenue requirements for customers or low-cost plan. But that's just the primary criterion. We also look at other factors that are important, such as risk mitigation, reliability, environmental sustainability, and safety and compliance. Next slide, please. And I wanted to reemphasize this. I've alluded to this earlier, but we do a system-wide IRP. So even though I mentioned that, we really don't do an IRP plan specifically for Kansas that we file, however, we still are planning for Kansas customers through this rather robust process. We have all the loads. We don't do an IRP specifically for Missouri. We don't do one specifically for Arkansas, Oklahoma. It's done for our total company. Everybody's load is in there. Just like our major assets, the resources that come from these plans. We have wind resources in Kansas. We've got a combustion turbine at a plant in Riverton, Kansas. But really, they serve all customers, just like we have Missouri resources and an Arkansas resource, but they are there for all customers. We do meet with some stakeholders from Kansas annually. We just had our most recent fuel procurement and planning meeting in December of 2021. I was a part of that. And I think members of Kansas Corporation Commission staff and CURB were on hand, and we talked about fuel procurement and planning, that both, what happened in 2021, what do we expect for the coming years. And when we do finish a triennial filing, we do share our executive summary with them. And in fact, all of our main volumes of the IRP that I showed you before, they are available online, the non-proprietary versions. You can go to the Missouri Public Service Commission website. It's in their electronic filing system, or they call it EFIS. And I think we have our IRP executive summary on our website for customers to view also. Next slide, please. And that really kind of wraps up, what I wanted to speak to today, just to let you know about our robust planning process that we do a total company IRP. So we've got some contact information here. If you have any questions and want to reach out, you can reach out to myself, our lobbyist, Whitney Dameron, or Joel Cannon, who is Director of Governmental Affairs, and some folks you probably know. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tarter. Appreciate that. You talk about this in terms of volumes, from start to finish for all 7 or so volumes in an IRP. How long is that document? How big a document are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it can be pretty substantial. If I set it on my desk, it'd probably be 2 or 3 feet high. And then also we have, to do confidential versions of that, non-proprietary versions of that. So, it can be quite extensive.
And you're getting ready to turn in, you said April of 22 is your triennial over in Missouri. When does work begin on that document that would be due in April of 22?
Right. The rule says that if you want to apply for any waivers from the rule, you have to do that a year in advance. So we started that in April of 2021. And then we had our internal kickoff with a larger team of people throughout our organization, because it does take a lot of different people to your organization. We kicked that off in early June. And then we had our first IRP core team meeting and IRP review board meetings. I think in August is when we started off with that. We hired our consultants. We have Charles River Associates does the modeling. We have Black & Veatch doing the engineering review of our supply side candidate list and the commodity prices. We have Applied Energy Group doing demand side energy analysis. And we have Itron helping us with our IRP load forecast. So all of those things, kind of are staggered, but we start the load forecast probably in May. So yeah, it is quite extensive, and it's an ongoing process, and we're getting close to that filing deadline, as you mentioned. So, things are getting very busy right now.
Great. Other questions for Mr. Tarter?
Yes,
Representative
Mr.
Carr.
Chairman, my hand's up.
Yeah, Representative Carmichael, we got you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Charter, appreciate you being here this morning. I think that I want to talk to you about hydroelectric generation. I think that the rural electric cooperatives and the Bowersock Power Company are the only hydroelectric participants, if you will, in Kansas, other than Empire, which I think is probably the largest. Are we tapped out on hydroelectric power? I don't anticipate the Tennessee Valley Authority is going to start building new dams. And, you know, hydroelectric seems to be a fairly renewable, clean energy source. Have we exploited it in the Midwest to its fullest practical capacity?
Right. You had mentioned that we do have a 16 megawatt unit at Ozark Beach. It's been around since 1913. So yes, it's been a long time since, we've been able to, address hydro in this part of the country. Whenever we do candidate supply side, we do, brainstorm and look at things. We have looked at, the potential to kind of revitalize a dam that's in Riverton, Kansas, near Lowell. It's near our power plant. However, we did talk to some of the staff there and some engineering, and it was dropped. It was screened out because of cost and because it would be a pretty small unit anyway. So,
Thank you.
sure.
Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Todd, for the presentation. My question is related to demand on the demand side. I should have asked this of Mr. Britson as well, but what are you seeing in the ways of demand growth in Liberty's footprint? I know, 30 or 40 years ago, in the planning, there was a fairly high percentage load growth factored in, but I think it's tapered off now. I think a lot due to more efficient motors and lighting and so forth, but just wanted to get your take on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The load growth, I've worked at Empire for over 30 years, so I do remember whenever, you can almost like normalize the past years and then just apply, like 1 or 2% to it as your growth, and that could be a reasonable forecast. It has slowed down since then. Our particular service territory has had good customer growth. We did have kind of the Branson, Missouri boom in the 90s when we were much higher than probably the nation. However, we've kind of slowed back down too. As far as the IRP goes, though, I will say this, we do, as I mentioned, we do look at a base, a high, and a low. So you kind of cover yourself on the different things that could happen in the future. But we are kind of different from other Midwest utilities also in the fact that we are kind of dual peaking. Most people in this part of the country are predominantly summer peaking. Our all-time peak is actually in the winter. And I think in the last 10 years or 12 years, we've peaked in the winter 8 of those years. So, and that's something that's kind of reasonably new in my career. So we do have, growth during all seasons too. So that's another factor to the load growth that we have to look at.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Mr. Tarter, for your time this morning. I know it's a busy time, as you said, with your April deadline coming up. We appreciate you making us priority this morning.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
All right, we have one more conferee this morning, Mr. Andrew Ferris, Director of Electric Supply and Planning with KCBPU, one of the beneficiaries of the Bowersock Dam that we just talked about. And we'll welcome Mr. Ferris to the committee.
Good morning. This is Andrew Ferris with the Kansas City Board of Public Utilities. I do not have video this morning, so if you could pull up my program, my presentation, that'd be appreciated. Thank you very much. Again, yes, my name is Andrew Ferris, and I am the Director of electric supply planning at the Kansas City Board of Public Utilities. If you go to the next slide. The Kansas City Board of Public Utilities is a publicly owned electric and water utility serving approximately 65,000 electric customers and 53,000 water customers across Wyandotte County. The utility consists of approximately 33 substations and approximately 3,000 miles of electrical lines. The BPU owns 2 active power stations in Kansas City, Kansas, which includes coal, natural gas, and fuel oil generating units, and is a joint owner of the Dogwood Natural Gas Combined Cycle Facility in Pleasant Hill, Missouri, where we own 17% of the 650 megawatt unit. The BPU also has renewable power contracts with wind, hydro, landfill gas, and solar facilities. In 2021, renewables or carbon-free resources made up 57% of retail sales and 42% of total generation, while coal accounted for 45% of total generation and natural gas accounted for 13% of total generation output. Renewables or carbon-free resources made up about 64% of retail sales in 2020 and about 47% of total generation in 2020. Higher natural gas prices and higher market prices in SPP really contributed to the increase in coal output in 2021. Next slide, please. So what is an integrated resource plan? An integrated resource plan is really a tool or a methodology to outline an electric utility's resource needs over a long-term planning horizon. The IRP utilizes past and current data trends to forecast future assumptions, but it also attempts to understand variables that may impact decisions or trends moving forward. Those may include fuel price volatility, electrification, political policy changes, regulatory changes, etc. It is an ongoing and evolutionary process, really calling for reanalysis of the utility system plans as conditions, prices, costs, technologies, and power requirements change. Next slide, please. The BPU conducts a major integrated resource plan every 5 years. So not every 3 years like we just seen out of Empire. We do ours every 5 years. We do a 1 year annual small IRP, effectively just updating numbers and so forth that we publish out there. But really we do a major overhaul like you're seeing out of the other organizations, but every 5 years. As part of this process, we analyze our short-term and long-term peak load and energy requirements, including scenario analysis, such as electrification growth rate, customer class changes, etc. We then examine our current resource mix with lifetime planning scenarios, retirement dates, major maintenance requirements, etc. A gap analysis is performed for both the energy side as well as the capacity side. Future generation and demand side management programs are then explored. Each form of generation and demand side management program has various attributes, strengths, weaknesses, risks, costs, etc. As part of this process, the BPU also offers multiple opportunities for customer engagement throughout the process, including multiple public meetings, as well as document review and public comment, all prior to adoption by the publicly elected board. There is then a final reexamination and reevaluation of scenarios, requirements, action plans, etc. And after board satisfaction, the board has the ability to adopt the document. Next slide, please. I'll just touch briefly on our load forecasting and generation methodologies. As part of the load forecasting process, we review a compilation of historical data, including peak and consumption by class. We attempt to normalize that data by customer class, as each class is impacted differently by weather conditions. A baseline energy and peak load forecast is developed. Then several scenario adjustments are explored to determine the extent of various scenarios on either the peak or the overall consumption levels. These may include potential regulatory changes, EV adoption rates, rooftop solar adoption rates, demand side management programs, industrial load changes, etc. Next slide, please. From a generation and demand side management methodology standpoint, The goal is to develop a resource mix that most reasonably and most affordably meets its obligations and community goals. Those includes BPU's capacity obligations as part of the Southwest Power Pool requirements. As part of those obligations, BPU is required to maintain electric generating capacity of 112% of expected annual peak load. We also look at exposure to risk, fuel and technology diversity, operational flexibility, resiliency, environmental stewardship, and the expected customer cost of service. Next slide, please. The integrated resource plan is a key element in long-term resource planning because it is a formalized process that allows for input from stakeholders throughout the organization, throughout the community, and by the board, and provides each the ability to provide feedback, thoughts, goals, and objectives to help guide the overall direction. The IRP not only focuses on historical data, but also on future projections, technologies, environmental concerns, and customer input. Next slide, please. As part of the key findings, we are seeing that risk variables associated with fuel type, availability, resiliency, and environmental and political aspirations can have outsized impact on the cost variability that we see within the integrated resource plan. The SPP grid and the resource mix is more integrated today than it has ever been, and thus decisions at other utilities and at SPP itself can have a meaningful impact on the value of resource decisions locally at the Kansas City Board of Public Utilities. We're also finding both inside and outside of the integrated resource plan that customers, both large and smaller, are becoming more and more interested and involved in regards to our energy mix and our energy mix planning. And on that note, I'll take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Mr. Ferris. I'll start out on your last slide there. You talk about the risk variables, and one of those is political. What could you define the political risk variable as BPU sees it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a lot of obviously variabilities. One of the things that we have to explore at all utilities is, one, most of these investments are very long-term in nature, and so the more movement of short-term decisions, the more impact that can have on long-term investments that we put into place. And whether that be related to carbon tax scenarios, I think was mentioned earlier, which obviously could have a large impact on our resource mix today and going forward. And there's other plans, in the works, whether it be at the federal level or whether the state decided to do something that may impact certain resources and how those resources may operate going forward. So there's a lot of activity really at the federal level predominantly that could impact, one, whether it be a tax credit scenario associated with renewables or even storage, or whether that be more the stick side where a carbon tax or some of those scenarios may come into play that would impact, I'll say, coal most predominantly, but also natural gas to some extent.
Thank you. And a quick second question for you on your first bullet point there. You talk about customers large and small becoming more involved in regards to BPU's energy mix. I assume that's your generation mix. What trends are you seeing there? More involved in what way, and pushing back on what exactly?
So predominantly the people that we hear most from, obviously reliability. Anytime there's a storm, hopefully today we don't have any outages. I have not looked this morning, but resiliency and reliability are key to obviously all or nearly all of our constituents today. But the vast majority of the customers that I hear from directly is about our renewable portfolio and how can they take better advantage of being more renewable or having a lower carbon footprint. And so we hear more and more from those customers about participating either directly or indirectly with us to take a bigger stake in how we push our envelope forward in terms of our renewable position.
Okay, thank you for that. Other questions for Mr. Ferris? Have any hands up online? Don't see any. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ferris, for your time this morning. Thank you for appearing before the committee.
Thank you.
All right, committee. This is our last meeting before turnaround. We approved a slew of minutes in our last meeting. I don't think we'll need to meet at the rail. I think we can just come back in March and approve minutes when we get back. When we come back from turnaround, March 1st, we're going to have a presentation from the KCC on rate making and what goes into that and the process for that. We're going to hear from some of the groups who have their rates set by the KCC with their input and how they see the process and the information they provide. And then we're going to have on Thursday, March 3rd, we're going to have Curb and Paul Snyder will be here to talk about the folks who think that maybe rates should be something other than what they are. And to Representative Carmichael's point, we'll spend the week on rates and rate making and talking about the good, bad, and ugly of that process and get a feeling for where Kansas is at relative to its neighbors and maybe why. So I do want to thank all of the conferees that we had today. I hope that the takeaway from this is that all of these utilities have to be very deliberate in terms of trying to plan. And I appreciate in particular Mr. Britson being very candid. I mean, you heard him say Evergy took a chance on coal, and then natural gas prices made that maybe the better investment to have made. But how many of us can predict what's going to happen in 5, 10, 20 years when it comes to sources and rates for very volatile supplies? So I don't envy any of the folks who testified this morning of the work they have to do to try to figure out what the right mix is going to be 5, 10, or 20 years down the road. That's an incredibly difficult job, and appreciate them kind of pulling back the cover and let us see some of what goes into that calculation. I want to talk just briefly and open it up for anyone on the committee. We have some thoughts as your committee leadership team on things we're going to cover in the second half of the session. But if there's something that you want more information on or something that you would like to have brought before the committee, this is your opportunity to let us know that. I'm not making any promises. It's a dictatorship, albeit a benevolent one. But I do want to hear from you and try to get topics in front of you that you want to hear about. So if there's anything that you're interested in or feel like you want more information on, here's your chance. Not all at once.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Representative Carmichael.
I really want to think a little bit about that request and hope that perhaps we could visit in a few days after I've had a chance to really try to make a more concise list. So I appreciate your indulgence. Thank you.
Representative Bergquist.
My questions that I didn't ask today because they were kind of theoretical, but questions about as different energy sources, either whether they're old like coal or sort of old like nuclear, as they ebb and flow in their importance in the stream, and maybe as years go by, maybe one of them will peak again. Is there a plan to be able to, in the review process of those years of its life cycle and whether to extend, if something, since it's not real cyclical, but they still happen, is there a plan available where updated to renew a license so that its life cycle would be extended further, say a coal plant or say a nuclear plant, rather than simply saying when that date comes, then we do it again. I know there's a lot of cost, but those are the things I think about because who would have thought we'd be where we are today 40 years ago in the overall picture we are. So 30, 40 years from now, we don't know where we're going to be. So keeping those options open and seeing whether something's effective to update early rather than waiting for the last minute on your third tire or all of them gone. So just spinning in my head, and it was better not ask while you guys were testifying. So thanks a lot.
We'll hang on to that, and we've still got some conferees, so we'll come back to that question. Are there other topics that you all want to see covered? As you think about it, feel free to send us an email. Let us know. We are working with a professor at Washburn Law School to come talk about property rights and utilities. So you kind of understand mineral rights and what goes on with subsurface stuff for petroleum and gas, as well as siting when it comes to solar and wind and some of the renewables that are folks are signing leases for. So I want to give you a grounding in property law, which you're all going to hate me for, but we'll cover some of that in the second half as well. And then we're working on trying to get you information on the siting process, the building process for generation, how those decisions are made. Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And maybe we'll cover this from your, when we talk about siting and property, but, you know, we've spent a number of years on, now just let me, on, good gracious, had it on the tip of my tongue. Like property rights, municipalities have their rights of way. That whole issue, we've dealt with that over the years, Mr. Chairman. And how are we? How does that look today and going forward? Because of all the new technologies that we're bringing online, it just might be a good discussion.
Sure. Okay, we can take a look at that. It dovetails nicely with what we're talking about. I think maybe Representative Delperdang talked a little bit about 5G and small scale facilities and that sort of thing. So it might be a good opportunity to dust that off and talk about it some more. Representative Delperdang.
If I can expound on the previous speakers, and hopefully I won't have the brain cramp here. I think we have brought up previously, I'd love to see some input from the KCC dealing specifically with right-of-way access, and especially if the given utility does not necessarily own the infrastructure in the ground, whether it be cable, fiber, pipes, whatever, but if they're leasing part of it out and allowing a third party to go into the right of way to access it, which I think is going to be critical as we move forward with more and more broadband. You might have a community that needs it. You might have a carrier that's sitting there with leased facilities available, and we've got the right of way issues where they can't go tap into it. So just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Sounds like we may be working towards a day on right of way. So anyone else? Okay, well, if you think of anything, let us know. Want to try to be responsive to the extent we can. And while we still have conferees, and Mr. Bridson, I'll pick on you because you're here physically. Do you want to respond to Mr. Representative Delperdang's, or sorry, Representative Berquist's thoughts on flexibility in your integrated resource planning, and when maybe you make the decision to take an aging asset and try to renew it and extend its useful life?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So with nuclear, there is a permitting process where I believe it's 40-year license lives. And so about 10 years before a license would expire, we will go in and talk to the regulators to see what upgrades we need to do to run the plant safely under a license extension. That's already has happened once for Wolf Creek, and we'll do an economic analysis of what upgrades need to be done to extend that life. So nuclear has a pretty good process. Of course, the risk to public safety is huge if you don't have that kind of process in place. I haven't said that, things come up. I'd mentioned the nuclear accident in Japan, Fukushima is what it's probably known as. That resulted in a number of upgrades called Fukushima Flex projects that had to be done to nuclear plants to provide resiliency or layers of protection. It's called defense in depth in the nuclear industry. With fossil-fired plants and renewables, we don't have that kind of permitting structure in place. It's really more largely about the environmental for the fossil stuff lately, a little bit so for the renewables even, is about the environmental. But we make decisions on an annual basis as we monitor the condition of equipment at power plants. Does it make sense to make a investment on behalf of the customers to replace that component, upgrade that component, or maintain that component? And those are really economic analyses that occur on an annual type basis. Is that helpful? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
If there's Representative Gardner.
You know, we've had a lot of discussion and I've asked a lot, well, Comfrey's the same question. We've talked about a state energy plan, and maybe, Mr. Chairman, down the road, we ought to have someone come in and maybe give us a presentation on what states do have a state energy plan, how has it worked, what are the positives, are there any negatives? I just think that we need to get additional information so we can, at some point, we're going to probably deal with that.
Anything else for the good of the order today? If not, thank you all for a good first half of the session, and we'll enjoy turnaround next week. And with that, we are adjourned.